If you're white, like unfortunately most of us in this room, you're probably like me and hadn't given much thought to Asheville's Confederate monuments until our country was made to look at them. I've worked in the North Carolina room for over 24 years, and I did not know any of the material we're presenting to you here today. I sure thought I knew local history pretty well. Most importantly, I did not know that most of the men, and they were men, honored by our city for many good works they did do, were also members of what was then called the Conservative Party of this state. And they did not believe in equality of the races, that blacks should have the right to vote, to represent themselves into court, or to be educated. If I didn't know this, I figured most of Asheville probably didn't either. Yet you and I, as citizens of this county, are to decide the future of our Confederate monuments. Many cities and historic committees are coming together and looking at different ways to judge their Confederate monuments. The three that I have found most significant are: does the monument honor someone who is known for other than their involvement in the Civil War? Is the person honored of local relevance? And is the monument offensive to parts of the community? Everybody know where the Robert E. Lee Monument is in Asheville? Sits right in the shadow of Vance Monument, and a lot of people miss it because we're looking at the Vance. That particular monument is a good example to look at with those three questions. We have provided you with a reading list book of things we recommend if you do want to dig into it a little deeper. We know that a lot of people don't have time to read, and so we thought many of you would still value the chance to be informed. One of our Friends board members, who happens to be our only black member, just the other day told me of an idea he had, a wonderful way to contextualize the Vance Monument. Besides getting his 40 acres back, he suggested we put up a life-size bronze monument of him next to the Vance Monument. And knowing Roy, I don't think he was entirely a joke. He said we could even have his mule standing beside him. A retired industrial engineer, board member of the Friends of the North Carolina Room and the YMI, a great storyteller, keeper of the gardens at the Eddington Center, a mentor to many, including me, and a general man about town. Please welcome Roy Harris.
I was getting ready to say good morning, but it's good afternoon. I'm a little late today. Thanks to the organizations that are represented here, and thanks to the board, the North Carolina Room. If I had not been to the North Carolina Room or have come to the North Carolina Room to research some information, I probably would not be here today. Tons of information in there, and I encourage you to partake of it, because once you get in that room, you will not leave. You will find a reason to come by the North Carolina Room, because one, for local history. But that's not my job here today. My job is to take you on a tour of the Confederate monuments that are here. Now, we all know this one because we see it all the time, but we're going to sort of take you through it, other ones, and as we go through it. As we get started here, this is a picture of before the monument was put up, and the courthouse was old courthouse was approximately where the overflowing water fountain is now on Pack Square. And so if you want to orient, the bank is on the other side over there, which will play in significance as we talk about these monuments. And so this is sort of, where the courthouse was. Now the courthouse is down on the other end of Pack Square, but the monument will go basically in the middle here where you see the two people standing. Well, there's the granddaddy of them all. And this is the one that, as we come up Pack Avenue all the time, this is usually one of the first things that I see as I'm walking up Pack Avenue. Oh, by the way, you can see it. I'm sure if they had built it at 150 feet instead of 75, you probably could have taken a picture of it from space. But it's 75-foot tall granite, and it was sponsored by the Vance Monument Association, which formed about a month after Vance died. The association had planned for the monument to be 150 feet tall, but did not have funding for it. It was announced in the newspaper on June the 1st, 1896, that George Pack said that if the county would give the land in front of the courthouse for a site for the monument, he would give $2,000 of the $3,000 needed for the erection. Architect R.S. Smith donated his service. This is the dedication ceremony here for the monument and the base of the monument. As you can see, there's probably about 70 masons that was part of this ceremony. And I think someone said that the mason dog is there.
Can you turn the volume up some?
Right. And as you can see, there's a dog in the picture here, and that was part of it. And so these are the masons that were standing around the monument. The Asheville Citizen Time did coverage of this event on the day of this event, but they did not, and they basically told who was there, who spoke, who was a big part of it, and it was a lot of people that you probably would think about later on as maybe the mayor of the city, someone from Wilmington, and so on. The next picture we will see is back when the newspaper coverage of it. If you go back one. Okay. All right, let's move on then. There was a group that was very instrumental in this monument and placing of this monument. The Daughters of the Confederacy requested all members be present. Alfred Waddell of Wilmington, North Carolina, had first accepted the invitation to speak, but he had to decline at the last moment. Governor Robert L. Taylor of Tennessee was the lone orator of that day. A large picture of Senator Vance looked out upon the square from the Powell and Snyder store, advertising. And so oddly, the paper did not cover the ceremony after the event, which sometimes papers will do that. They'll say we'll not advertise your event, but we will report on it. Let's go to the next picture. Oh, here's another picture of the old courthouse and the monuments. The Vance Monument is up now. The plaque was on the west face was added. It reads, in honor of Zebulon Beard Vance, Confederate soldier, war governor, U.S. senator, orator, statesman, on May the 30th, 1830, April the 14th, this tablet was placed by the Asheville chapter of the United Daughters of the Confederacy. As we go to the next picture, one of the things that intrigued me about this picture is, what do you see in it? There's a cannon. There's a cannon in front of it, decorated. They had unveiled the plaque. I think the plaque has the same words on it now that it had back then, and basically the words I read. This photo was taken by the Asheville Times at the day the tablet was unveiled. Also participating in the ceremony was the Bayard Birth chapter and the Kipling Rockwell Post of the American Legion. Yes, that's a German World War I cannon that was captured by Company 1, 321st Infantry. It was brought home by the boys that captured it and placed on the square in 1921. After 23 years, the cannon disappeared overnight, with a note saying that the iron and steel was needed for World War II. This is at the rededication ceremony, and so assume that is one of this gentleman here, I think, give tours downtown on a daily basis or a weekly basis and everything, and so he was part of the Masons. And I haven't quite figured out yet why he walks around it, but I'm sure that there's a significance for it, for the reason that he's there. The monument was rededicated after a $150,000 restoration on June the 6th, 2015. Speeches were made by a politician, Vance historian, and fundraiser. During the ceremony, racial strife in the 19th century, segregation, and the fact that Vance had been a slave owner were noted. Also mentioned was an effort to raise a monument to African Americans. Second monument.
Hold on.
Oh, I was coming down the street the other day and I took my cell phone camera out and I said, wow. And then I got up and I realized that it had nothing to do with the monument. They were taking down a crane from over where the art center is going to be and where they're so. I said, oh man. But there is a possibility. This is the second monument. The second monument erected here was the Confederate Soldiers Monument at Newton Academy Cemetery at the intersection of Biltmore Avenue, and it was dedicated in 1903. And I didn't know this one was up here until a couple of days ago. I found myself up in front of it and everything. And so, this granite obelisk was erected by the Asheville chapter, Daughters of the Confederacy, to the Confederate Dead buried in this cemetery. This is assumed to be the oldest Confederate monument in the state to be placed by the United Daughters of the Confederacy. The third monument. The third monument was dedicated a little later in 1903. It is referred to as the Confederate Monument, also the Thresh Monument. It was placed in the Montecero Methodist Church in Candler, North Carolina. It was erected by Captain A.B. Thresh of the 25th Regiment and includes those names. And in this picture, if you can see that there's gentlemen standing around the monument, and these were some of the Confederate soldiers, and it was at this time, I guess they were celebrating an anniversary or something, and maybe at that time they were, a lot of them were aging out, and so this is one way for them to celebrate. Oh, by the way, 1905, when things really got going, 3 Confederate monuments was dedicated on a single event, which occurred at the Buncombe County Courthouse at Pack Square, where all 3 were placed. This is the only time in state history that multiple Civil War monuments were dedicated on the same day and location. The 3 monuments were the monument to 60th Regiment North Carolina Volunteers, the Colonel B. Creasman's monument, and the monument to honor T.L. Clingman. This photo is the 1903 courthouse, shows 2 of the 3 Confederate monuments, with the Clingman monument in view at the right, and then the other monument is right there in the center of the picture. It is said that the Creasman monument was seated in front of the courthouse, but we don't have a picture showing it. If someone has a better picture than that, maybe we can figure out where the third one's at. And then we have the Creasman's monument. The monument is a tribute to the valor of Confederate troops from Buncombe County. It was later moved to its current location on the north side of the 1928 courthouse in a famous Confederate charge to the Battle of Chickamauga on September 30, 1893. It has 680 words on it while covering. Here's the Clingman Monument in Riverside. And then we go back and we'll get to the monument that is in front, as you say, the shadows. This one is on the side of the courthouse, and there's a number of things that are happening there, and so you can go see that monument. Okay? Last one. It's the Robert E. Lee. And there's two monuments in one sense here. On the Robert E. Lee on the side that's facing the street, and on the other side, there's a monument also that is to Colonel John Conley Marker. It was placed in 1926 in the shadow of the Vance Monument. This monument here is in the courthouse, the old courthouse, entrance to the old courthouse. You can't go in the main door, you have to go around, and so when you come through the maze, you'll get back and you'll see this monument. And on the wall, there's a big clock hanging up above it. So that is the monument that is in the courthouse. And as you can see, and our last one that we want to talk about is the one that is at the last photo is the Buncombe County Civil War Memorial located at the Smith McDowell House on Victoria Road. It was erected by Buncombe County native Eric Emery, researcher and public fundraiser, and was dedicated in 1919. And there's a number of stones all around it with all the names of the regiments and the people that was in those particular units. As you can see, we have our share of monuments here in Buncombe County. And just as a last statement, I was coming from Raleigh the other day, and I'm riding along I-40, and somewhere around Statesville, there's this huge flag flapping over. It was almost over I-40. It was put there because they wanted to make sure that you saw it, and you will be able to see it the rest of your life. Thank you very much.
Again, my name is John Elliston, and I sit on the Friends of the North Carolina Room Board, and I can speak on behalf of all of us in saying how grateful we are for you showing up on a cold Saturday. And I think it's a testament to just how compelling the issue is and how much dialogue we need to be having about it. I'm going to take just about 10 minutes to tackle the topic in front of you, so I'm really skating across the surface here. Everything I'm about to show you came from the North Carolina Room. And there's a lot more of it where this came from. So I urge you to go dig around. You'll find some things I'm sure that we haven't found yet. I appreciate Roy's survey of the monuments. I grew up in Asheville and would scratch my head sometimes and wonder, like, what do these monuments actually mean? When I was pretty young, I'd come downtown to go to PAC or to the Health Adventure, and I would pass the most prominent monument in town. And I was so proud to have the Washington Monument in downtown Asheville. The founding father of the whole nation, and his monument was here. I learned to read. I read the name Vance. I said, who is this guy? On a grade school field trip to the Vance birthplace, which is still a state historic site, I learned who Vance was. He was described to me as a mountain boy who went from cabin to the halls of power in his state capital and indeed in the national capital. He was, I was told, a lot like Abraham Lincoln. Turns out Vance wasn't a lot like Abraham Lincoln. And he would not have liked that description. We know that because Vance was very clear about how he felt about the Civil War. He was an avid combatant as a soldier and as our Civil War governor. And one reason he was so avid about it was because of his views on race. His most recent biographer, Gordon McKinney, states it pretty succinctly in what is a pretty glowing biography overall. He says of Vance, all of his life he assumed that African Americans were intellectually and morally inferior to whites. He was an avowed racist who used the racism of other whites for personal advantage and political purposes. I don't think Vance would dispute that today. We hear a lot of discussions about Vance begin with the phrase, he was a slave owner, but. He was a slave owner, but he had enlightened views about the Jewish faith. He was a slave owner, but he defended the civil liberties of Civil War whites. He was a slave owner, but this, that, and the other. Part of why I think he's spoken about that way is because of his incredible skills at communication. He was first and foremost a great communicator, an orator, with few parallels certainly in our state at the time. And on the topic of race, he was characteristically eloquent. There's old Zeb himself. During roughly the Civil War period, maybe just a bit before. On the issue of race, as the war was beginning, he said, "Even the mind of a fanatic recoils in disgust and loathing from the prospect of intermingling the quick and jealous blood of the European with the putrid stream of African barbarism." This is an eloquent person, and he brought his rhetorical skills to his views on race. And so when they built a monument to Vance, just a few years after his death, they were thinking about race as well, and they were thinking about the war as well. The document of the unveiling was May 10, 1898. The date had a significance not as Vance's birthday or death anniversary. It was Confederate Memorial Day. And for such an auspicious occasion, the committee that brought this monument that still stands wanted to select a speaker who would share Vance's message. At first, they invited John Daniel, a Virginia politician who was one of the great progenitors of the lost cause mythology of his day. He started to share the doctrine that slavery was a benevolent institution, that the South fought for righteous purposes, and that its cause would be vindicated with post-Reconstruction policies. He was busy, he couldn't make it. So next they reached out to Wilmington's Alfred Waddell. He was thrilled to make an appearance, he wrote. Being Confederate Memorial Day, one of the leading white supremacists in the state had a lot of invitations to speak that day, but he decided he would come speak to honor Vance. He wound up in court. He's an attorney at the time, couldn't make it, so he had to send his regrets. But he made up for it later in the year when he helped spearhead what we now call the Wilmington Massacre. Waddell almost personally led the first and only successful coup d'etat in domestic American political life, where the interracial government of Wilmington was overthrown in 1898, the black businesses and newspapers burned out, scores of black people massacred, and the end of a functioning democracy in Wilmington. So Waddell was busy in his place. The committee successfully invited the governor of Tennessee at the time, Robert Taylor, to speak. He was a more mild-mannered white supremacist, but would spend much of the year supporting Tennessee legislation that would disenfranchise black folks. And that's the way it went throughout the year of 1898, the year when North Carolina stepped away from multiracial democracy for decades because of the events of 1898. The year began in Asheville with an address by the local Democratic Men's Club. They called themselves the Zeb Vance Democratic Club. Speaking on January 3 of that year was the ex-mayor of town, William Koch. His speech is 35 pages long if you want to go read it. A lot of it doesn't make any sense to me. The parts that do are clear enough. He was kind enough to emphasize late in the speech the importance of the next election in North Carolina. The great issue confronting the people looms as it presses to the front and overshadows all others, the issue of white supremacy. The Anglo-Saxon must assert his supremacy and superiority and again control the affairs of our people. In fact, the Democrats did win statewide control that year and began to set in motion moves to deny black folks basic rights like the right to vote under the cover of literacy tests and what have you. In 1900, the vote came before the state's voting eligible citizens, and Asheville was a hotbed of the white supremacy movement that sprang up to support that. In fact, 3 days before the vote in 1900, Asheville had what I probably would assume was the biggest political rally then in the city's history. Thousands of people came out to line the streets and march in the streets to support the white supremacist cause. There were so many torches, they used 100 gallons of oil for the torches. There were 100 men on horseback. There was firing of rifles. There were chants, there were screams. They fired the anvils. Does anyone know what it means to fire the anvils? I was shocked to learn this. You know what an anvil is? They would put an anvil down, sprinkle gunpowder on it, put another anvil on top, and blow that anvil into the sky over the Vance Monument repeatedly. It was a very martial celebration, and you can only imagine, I hope you can only imagine what our streets looked like filled with so many torches a la Charlottesville. They carried signs that day. The newspaper printed some of them. The constitutional amendment passed. Blacks were effectively denied the right to vote in North Carolina, and the white men of the West, as the newspaper put it, had helped play a key part in that. Amidst that celebration, an audacious act of resistance. All we know is that a black man stepped out with a pistol and fired at the leaders of the march. We don't know his name because he got away. They found his pistol and they searched high and low for him, but he got away. So in 1903, as Roy was telling you, our monument started springing up on ever fertile ground around here, mostly through the efforts of the Daughters of the Confederacy. And as with Vance and as with his cohorts, we know what their feelings were on race, and you can find out in the North Carolina room if you go read their catechisms for children, of which they had about 100. And I'm going to keep you curious and let you guess what sort of things they might have had to say about slavery and the war and the lost cause and the monuments that they were putting in place at the time. And that very briefly is where we were at locally in a political sense. Fitzhugh Brundage is here to talk to us about a broader scene in the South and the decades that preceded it and have followed since, and how we can look at some of these important issues. Fitz is the chairman of the history department at UNC Chapel Hill. He has spearheaded a great online resource called Commemorative Landscapes of North Carolina. We highly recommend it. There you can find very good information, not only on our Civil War monuments, but all kinds of historical monuments in the state. And it's a fascinating window into what we choose to remember and where it came from. I'm going to get Fitz set up with the presentation, and we'll be right back with you in just a moment.
All right, well, let me just start by saying what a privilege and a pleasure it is for me to be here. And I also want to salute not only the organizers, whose names I can't all remember that I met today, but it's been a pleasure, but I also want to commend the community of Asheville for having this conversation, not just in this room, but the conversation that Asheville's been having for a substantial period of time now. I think it's a productive, if sometimes perhaps uncomfortable conversation, but a conversation that's long overdue, not just in Asheville, but across the United States. So what I want to do is spend, I don't know, maybe 20, 25 minutes talking about Civil War memory in the state of North Carolina. So taking what happened, if you will, the commemorative landscape of Asheville, and putting it in a slightly larger context. And if I could distill this down to one point, it's that I'd like you to take away the fascinating, to me it's a fascinating historical characteristic, that the commemorative landscape, and you'll see what I'm talking about as I talk about commemorative landscape as we go on, but the commemorative landscape of the Confederacy in North Carolina and in the United States is a commemorative landscape of defiance. If there's one word I would use, it's defiance. And it's worth us thinking about why defiance. It's not a landscape of contrition. It's not a landscape of regret. It's a landscape of defiance. And so that's what I'd like to try to provoke some thoughts about today. Now, the first thing I want to start with is the scale of Confederate defeat. And I think that's important for us to recognize when we try to think about what white Southerners were doing in the aftermath of the Civil War and on into the 20th century when they commemorated the Confederacy. So what do I mean about the scale of the defeat? It's important. We don't typically tell the story of the Civil War this way because in the classic American narrative, it's a war of tremendous heroic struggle and valor, which is all fine. I'm not here to puncture that. But the Confederacy was devastated. And I'm not talking about in the sense of houses burned. And I'm talking about a military defeat of epic scale. The Confederacy was hammered. So what do I mean by that? Well, there, I realize that's very small for you to see, unfortunately, on a screen this size. But remember how Jefferson Davis was captured. Now, this is the Union version of that. And I want to acknowledge that that's, shall we say, exaggerated. But nevertheless, that is the version of, so the president of the Confederacy, this wannabe slaveholders' republic, as Northerners saw it, was captured as he was escaping helter-skelter across the boondocks of Georgia, dressed as a woman. Now, he may have been wearing things, a shawl or something, but the depiction of him, as you can see here, is in the garb of a woman. What more ignominious defeat could there be than to have the president of your nation captured trying to hide dressed as a woman? Then there was the devastation. Think, at the end of the Civil War, every Confederate city of any size, with the exception of parts of Texas, but every Confederate city of any size had been captured by the Union. And some of them, including the capital of the Confederacy, had been devastated by fire, Atlanta, Columbia. So every center of Confederate population of any size had fallen into Union hands. Then we have the scale of the wounded and the scarred. Now, one of the things, as you probably know about the Civil War, is because the Confederacy lost, and because, in fact, Jefferson Davis was hustling his way across the hinterlands of Georgia with the archives of the Confederacy with him. Well, not all of them were with him. Some had been lost along the way. But we don't really have good records about a lot about the Confederacy. So we don't even really know how many white men served in the Confederate Army. But let's just, the estimates range anywhere from 750,000 to somewhere over 1 million, 1.25 million. Of that number, probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 200 to 300,000 were wounded. And so again, I apologize, these images are small for you all to see, but there's that one telling anecdote. It's often repeated, but even as many times as I've heard it and repeated it, it still has power to me. In 1866, 1/5 of Mississippi's state budget was spent on artificial limbs. Now, Mississippi's state budget was really small back then, but nevertheless, they figured 1/5 of every taxpayer's dollar was going to buy artificial legs, crutches, what have you, for that huge number of wounded. So there's the physical devastation of the landscape as a result of this war. Then there's the scarred. And I won't even go into the whole issue of the mental scars that, of course, were carried by that generation who fought in that war. But let's talk, too, about Confederate dead. Again, we don't know how many Confederates died during the war because we don't know how many fought. But again, the estimate is roughly the same as the wounded. So perhaps somewhere between 250,000 to as many as 300,000 Confederates died during the war. Now, that means somewhere between 1 in 5 and 1 in 3 Confederates died during the war. Now, of that huge number, of course, many of them died in those heroic settings. North Carolinians like to say they were first at Bethel, so the first Confederate to die was the North Carolinian. They went furthest at Gettysburg in Pickett's charge, etc. Those are the heroic moments when someone died fighting for the Confederacy. But at least as many, probably more, died of typhoid, died of dysentery, died of tuberculosis, died of diarrhea, died in less than heroic circumstances, not on the battlefield. And that's not to, I'm not pointing that out to detract in any way from their service. I'm just pointing it out that there were literally tens of thousands, maybe even more than 100,000 who died in less than romantic or heroic conditions. So what's the purpose of pointing out this litany of scars? I know I need to show this last image. This is an image of the Confederate Dead at Franklin, Tennessee, after the Battle of Franklin, which was one of the most mindless slaughters of the Civil War, just bodies piled high. This is the kind of military defeat that, yes, you could say it was heroic, but in retrospect, you would look upon it as an utter military failure. So, the reason I start with this is it's entirely understandable that the post-Civil War generation of white Southerners wanted to figure out a way to mourn a loss on this scale. They had, that is, white Southerners had rolled the dice and bet everything, and they had lost colossally. Every single aim they had going into that war, they surrendered at Appomattox. So, it's entirely understandable that white Southerners were going to spend a generation or more trying to figure out what the meaning of this struggle was. Now, it's fair to say Northerners were doing the same thing. This bloodletting on this scale had to be made sense of. But we're not talking about Northerners here. We're talking about Southerners. And there are three groups of Southerners who were really active. Three particular groups who were really active in trying to work out this question. How do we make sense of this defeat? And the first group that I want to talk to, these are the actors. First group I want to talk about are the clerics, white clerics. As you would imagine, as Christians who believed in a kind of providential purpose, God did things for reasons, history unfolded according to God's plan. If you're a white Christian, after Appomattox, you've got a pressing question on your mind. What happened? What is God telling us? Well, these two men, and there were others, but these two men in particular tried to answer that question. Like everyone who goes into war, I wouldn't say everyone, but as is characteristic of Americans when they go into war, they believe God is on their side. And white Southerners were convinced in 1861 God was on their side. So what had happened? God had favored white Southerners, they believed. God had had a transcendent purpose for the Confederacy. So how do we make sense of Appomattox? Well, white Southerners, like Father Ryan and Robert Louis Dabney, concluded that white Southerners were like the latter-day Israelites. So God was going to use the ungodly to test his chosen people. The Civil War was a test of white Southern Christendom. So this wasn't a sign of God scorning them. This is a sign of God's love and part of this elaborate providential purpose he had for them. So let me use their words here. Father Abram Ryan, Episcopalian, was one of the most beloved clerical contributors to the theology of the lost cause. And he wrote a poem, a long, in that classic 19th century form, goes on for pages and pages and pages, The Land We Love. And in it, he says, quote, each link of the chain that enslaves shall bind us closer to thee. Now, what is the link of the chain that enslaves? He's not talking about the slavery of African Americans. He's talking about the links of the chain of the Union. We are shackled to the Union. And he's not talking about that binding us closer to thee because the Union is God's great architectural design, if you will. But this is a challenge. This is a test. So the trial that white Southerners had suffered during the war and its aftermath were reminders that wickedness could threaten God's chosen. Here's how a South Carolina Methodist put it. Quote, to be innocent and to be oppressed are the body and soul of Christianity. So we were innocent and we are oppressed. But this allows us to demonstrate the resolve of our faith even more. So, post-war clerics, like Father Ryan and Robert Louis Dabney, were crucial because they not only gave religious meaning to this, but they also gave religious meaning to the history. So Robert Louis Dabney, as you may know, very influential Southern Presbyterian cleric. Very, very influential. He not only defended slavery, he not only defended secession, but he also argued for the eventual vindication of the white South. And that God's providential plan that had included slavery, that had included secession, had included the Confederacy, would ultimately end up with some sort of providential outcome in which white Southerners would be victorious, not on the battlefield, but in the realm of faith and in the realm of race relations. So he implored white Southerners not to doubt the benevolence of Providence or their special destiny. And this is how another cleric, this is not Dabney's words I'm quoting, but this is how another cleric put it in 1869. The Civil War, he said, had been, quote, a necessary disciplinary ordeal chosen by God to prepare white Southern Christians for their high and holy mission as custodians of unadulterated evangelicalism and as his honored instruments for the development of a pure Christian civilization throughout the continent and throughout Christendom. So think about that. That's 4 years after Appomattox. And there are already clerics saying, yeah, but that's just a minor defeat. Yeah, Appomattox, unfortunately. But we are going to lead white civilization to a new era in Christendom. So what does this mean? You know, this is clerics in their most grandiloquent phase. But what it means is that these clerics were sacralizing the Civil War, and they were sacralizing the Confederate warriors who fought in it. So there was going to be no question that the Civil War was somehow an immoral war, or that the Confederates had been immoral for waging it. They resolved that question. And they also claimed that there was a kind of providential purpose for the war. So no single Confederate, indeed Confederates themselves, really weren't at fault for losing the war. That had been God's plan. And that's an incredibly, you can imagine, for devout Christians of the 19th century, that must have lifted an enormous load off of some of them. And that's a legacy that I just want to offer just a personal anecdote here about how long this legacy of a kind of sacralized lost cause lasted. When I was a child, my family attended an Episcopal church in Virginia. And in the Episcopal church, there were a number of flags hanging from the rafters. There was the flag of Virginia, the flag of the United States, the flag of the Episcopal Church, and there was the Confederate battle flag. Now, why was the Confederate battle flag hanging in an Episcopal church? I think here's the answer. So clerics, very quickly after the war, sacralized the lost cause. Then, of course, there's a group who had an obvious reason to be invested in this. And again, I know I keep apologizing for how small the pictures are. But veterans were, of course, keen to give meaning to the war. They, after all, had put their lives on the line. And initially, like veterans of most wars, immediately after the Civil War, most Confederate veterans were not too keen to get together and reminisce about the war. But as the years passed, they began to organize themselves into larger and larger groups. And then in 1889, a group of them formed the United Confederate Veterans. And from roughly 1889 to, we'll say, roughly 1910, the United Confederate Veterans loomed very large in the landscape of Confederate commemoration. At its peak, there were somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,500 camps, as they were called, local units of the United Confederate Veterans. And perhaps as many as 80,000 Confederate veterans were members of the UCV. And they published a journal called the Confederate Veteran, which had about 50,000 readers and was the major organ, if you will, for publicizing all things Confederate in the late 19th, early 20th century. So the image, and again, I know these are tiny for you to see, but you can imagine the image of the aged and hobbled Confederate veteran was sort of iconic in the late 19th, early 20th century South. They were, of course, targets of charity in part because some of these men, as you'd imagine, some of them had been wounded. Some of them had, no one called it this at the time, but almost certainly had suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder. And so some of them had led hard lives. So beginning in that, especially the 1890s, across the South, both private groups and then sometimes with state funding, veteran homes like the Raleigh Veterans Home were founded. So they were objects of charity. But they were also, they of course wanted to be venerated. And so they were crucial as the objects of veneration. So as they got older, they were, and this sounds sarcastic, I don't mean it that way at all, but they were sort of wheeled out, if you will, and if on Confederate Memorial Day, you would find the local Confederate veterans, and they would be expected to participate. Whenever a monument was going up, you'd find the local Confederates, get them in the uniform, and bring them out. So they were sort of a living embodiment of the legacy of the Confederacy. But of course, the major challenge for these veterans was they were doomed to die. And so they could not carry on the memory of the Confederacy themselves. The United Confederate Veterans did form an organization for the Sons called the Sons of Confederate Veterans, but frankly, the Sons of Confederate Veterans was not a terribly significant organization until well into the 20th century. So in the early 20th century, the Sons of Confederate Veterans were not an important player in the creation of the Confederate, or perpetuation of the Confederate commemoration. So as I said, they were objects of veneration, and the people who did the venerating were the white women of the South. And there are good reasons for this, obviously. I mean, one important reason was the Victorian tradition of mourning placed tremendous cultural importance on women and the roles that women played in mourning. The fact, too, that this was a war in which men went off and died meant, of course, there were women left, daughters, sisters, wives, etc., who were mourning lost men. So there are a variety of reasons why women would play a crucial role in the commemoration of individual Confederates. But, excuse me, precisely because there was such a massive loss of life as a result of the Civil War, traditions of Victorian mourning in the South had to change. What had been often a highly stylized, drawn-out, private mourning, that wasn't possible on this scale. And so a sort of collective mourning traditions began to develop. And one of the very earliest was Confederate Memorial Day, which we heard referenced with regards to the Vance Monument. Confederate Memorial Day seems to have arisen in Columbus, Georgia in 1866, and it spread very quickly across the South. And by the 1870s, the tradition of white women going out on Confederate Memorial Day, placing flowers on graves of Confederates and conducting other sort of memorial services became ubiquitous in the South. Women played another role, not just in commemorating on Confederate Memorial Day, but literally in creating the cemeteries for the Confederacy. And I picked their Oakwood Cemetery in Raleigh, North Carolina, which some of you may know. It's the largest, I suppose well, maybe it's not any longer the largest, but certainly the most historically prominent cemetery in Raleigh. That's typical of the cemeteries that white women across the South created to inter Confederate dead who were moved from elsewhere, from battlefields in the North or elsewhere in the South. Because after the Civil War, the federal government paid to reinter the bodies of Union soldiers who fell all over the South. They went into federal cemeteries across the country, including the South, or they were moved north. Well, the federal government was not going to pay to reinter Confederates. So private groups had to raise money and dig up the Confederates who were buried in mass graves at Gettysburg, Antietam, wherever they may be. And that's exactly what they did at Oakwood Cemetery. It's a remarkable testament to the energy and the organizing capacity. And it was a gruesome, as you can imagine, what this was like in 1867 to be digging up bodies, shipping them to be reburied in the South. It was a gruesome business. But it was a hugely important activity for these white Southern women because they created these spaces where mourning could be appropriately conducted, and essentially these cemeteries became shrines to the Confederacy. Of course, as we heard again earlier, women did more than just memorialize the Confederacy on Memorial Day at cemeteries. They also played an incredibly prominent role in the erection of monuments across the South. Indeed, I think you can say no one played a more important role in the erection of monuments between 1890 and 1930 in the South than Southern white women, especially the United Daughters of the Confederacy. And I included down here at the bottom the Washington State UDC chapter from 1925, just to emphasize the UDC was across the United States. And it helps you to understand why there are Confederate monuments in Arizona, why there's a Confederate monument in Montana. You might not have thought that Montana would be a likely site, but wherever there was a UDC branch, you could be sure they would find some pretext. There'd be some obscure connection that would justify erecting a Confederate monument in the hinterlands of the United States. So let's talk a little bit about the landscape that white Southerners created, and especially these women in the United Daughters of the Confederacy. So let's start at the beginning. In the early monuments, this is the first Confederate memorial in North Carolina that I'm aware of in Cumberland County, Fayetteville. 1868, very soon after the war, obviously. This is a monument erected in a cemetery, and it may be hard for you to see, but shall we describe it as sort of like an obelisk with a cross on the top. It picked up, if you will, it used the language, the aesthetic language of mourning, of funereal art, as was appropriate to the setting. It is a monument to honor Confederate dead. And many of the earliest monuments were precisely that. They were monuments of expression of grief and mourning. But as the years went by, the organizational capacity, so this was not put up by the United Daughters of the Confederacy. I should have mentioned that. They didn't even exist in 1868. They would be founded in the 1890s. So at first, these monuments were put up by local groups raising money locally. Women were masters of organizing fairs and tableaus and all sorts of money-making schemes to raise the pennies and nickels and dimes and quarters that would be raised to build a monument like that. But by the late 19th century, with the founding of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, and a few other organizations, as well as the kind of much more muscular women's organizations of the late 19th century. I mean, these were powerful groups of women, club women as they were called, who had much better fundraising skills than men typically, and were tireless. They began to build monuments on a different scale. And these are the examples from North Carolina. These, I would have to look at them more closely to remember all of them. Rocky Mount I see there, Asheboro, Pittsboro. These are the monuments we take for granted now. These are the classic Confederate monuments of a Confederate soldier standing on top of a pedestal, 20, 30, 15 feet high, in public, important, conspicuous public space. Typically in front of the courthouse, but if there wasn't a courthouse in the community because it wasn't a county seat, they would find a major thoroughfare, some conspicuous space, so that it became a sort of focal point of civic identity. Well, between 1890 and 1920, white Southern women cluttered the landscape of the South and North Carolina with these monuments. And they also did some on a much more massive scale. I use the North Carolina examples. If you want to see the massive ones, of course, all you need to do is go to Monument Avenue in Richmond. And you can see the Jefferson Davis Memorial that the United Daughters of the Confederacy put up. After they raised the money, men tried to do it for about 5 years, failed utterly, turned it over to the United Daughters of the Confederacy. 8 years later, the monument was up. You can also go to Stone Mountain, Georgia, and you can see what the United Daughters of the Confederacy started. Then it got stolen away from the UDC. So Stone Mountain was begun by the UDC, but it took, as you all know, the saga of that. But in other words, they started building monumental Confederate sculptures. Now, they were cluttering the South with these monuments, the public spaces of the South. And by roughly 1920, 1930, the consolidation of Confederate commemoration was complete. Now, I want to emphasize that they were, of course, doing this in a competitive landscape. By competitive landscape, I just draw your attention to these monuments to Union generals in Washington, D.C. Most of us don't think about it when we move around in Washington, D.C., but Washington, D.C. is a huge commemorative landscape to the Union cause. So when you get off the metro stop at Farragut Square, you don't think to yourself, oh, I'm getting off at this shrine to a Union, admiral in this case. You don't think when you're, if you're in DuPont Circle going past the Hilton there in DuPont Circle, and there's that big sculpture of McClellan, you probably don't even pay attention to it. It's a guy on a horse. But there are 17 major monuments to Union generals in Washington, D.C., plus other monuments. But I'm just picking at, these are major pieces of sculpture that most Southern communities couldn't possibly afford. They didn't have the money to build them on that scale. So these are major pieces of late 19th, early 20th century sculpture. So white Southerners were keenly aware that they were competing with that. You know, that's immediately across the river from Lee Jefferson Davis Highway in Alexandria. So this is, you know, this is the counter narrative they're trying to compete with when they're building up their monuments across the South. And so white Southerners talked a lot in the late 19th, early 20th century about how they were falling behind the Northerners. But they were also competing closer to home. And I'm going to work around counterclockwise here. This small monument you see on the left is a truly remarkable monument. It's one of the most interesting monuments in North Carolina precisely because of how unusual it is. It is a monument put up by a group of African American women in Hertford, North Carolina, to the Union soldiers who fought in the Civil War. Now, why in Hertford, North Carolina in 1910 did black women put up a monument to Union soldiers? Well, they did it in part because, as you may know, that's in eastern North Carolina. It was one of the first parts of the Confederacy captured by the Union. It fell spring of 1862. They captured that part of North Carolina, occupied it. They raised African American troops there as soon as the Union Army started to enlist African American troops. And then it was occupied by African American troops once there were African American units. So this is a monument, as best we can tell, to colored soldiers in general, but also to colored soldiers from Hertford. It is exceptional. There are perhaps, the count that I've seen is there were 7 monuments to African American soldiers erected in the South prior to the 1990s. There are 2 in a cemetery in Norfolk, Virginia, to African Americans. There's 1 in Kentucky in public space. There's this one, and as I say, a few others. So this is one where the African American community, it appears to be African American Baptist women, erected this, and they erected it on a public thoroughfare. Now what's interesting is a block away, at roughly the same time, we don't know the dedication date for that monument yet, but roughly a block away, well, a block and a half away, the United Daughters of Confederacy erected a monument. And it's dedicated to our soldiers. And I just love, the meaning of that, our soldiers. So this is one of those rare places where you can see the African American memory of the Civil War, which is very different than what was a block and a half away at the UDC commemoration of the Civil War. And I draw this out because most African American communities in this era, as we were hearing about, this was not an era when erecting a monument to Union soldiers, black Union soldiers in the Confederacy was something you did lightly. You had to raise the resources, find public space to put it up at a time when segregation was being erected. It wasn't going to happen in most Southern communities. My guess is they bought a funereal piece of sculpture and adapted it to this purpose. And they had enough pride, confidence, courage to go ahead and do that. And many other African American communities, as a result of poverty, as a result of the challenges that the African American community faced at that time, couldn't do that. So how did African Americans remind others, themselves and white Southerners, about their memory? Well, they did it through Emancipation Day parades. Again, that upper right, is a wonderful photograph of Richmond, of the Emancipation Day Parade in Richmond, Virginia. If you happen to go to the new Smithsonian Museum of African American History, you can see that photograph blown up. It's huge, almost life-size. It's quite striking photograph. Every January 1st, in some communities, there were different dates in different areas of the South, but up until the 1920s, 1930s, in some communities, Norfolk, Virginia had very large Emancipation Day parades well into the 1930s. The African American community celebrated the end of slavery and Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. Also in Virginia, interestingly enough, the African American community celebrated the day that Lee surrendered at Appomattox. That must have been twisting the blade a little. And then just another example is African Americans also celebrated Memorial Day. They didn't celebrate Confederate Memorial Day, they celebrated National Memorial Day. And African Americans would go to the federal cemeteries, the national cemeteries in the South, and honor the Union on those dates. That had to have been just, again, twisting the blade there. And finally, I don't have an example of one of these Memorial Day, a photograph of Memorial Day celebrations in the South. So there I'm using, that's 1912 New York City Memorial Day with black Union veterans at the front of the parade. So Memorial Day became another one of these opportunities to remind the black community, at least, and any whites who would acknowledge it, that black people had a different experience in the Civil War, and indeed, they looked upon the Civil War not as a defeat, but as a victory. So, I'm near the end here, before I wear out my welcome. So we are living in this inherited landscape. And what does this landscape of North Carolina look like? Well, I'm very glad we got some free advertising for commemorative landscapes of North Carolina. It's been a pleasure to work with some talented people to create that site. Right now, last time I looked, we'd gotten to 928 monuments in this state, an inventory of them. We're going to probably hit about 1,000, and we make no claim that we will have a total inventory, because you find some monument in some place where you just never expect it. But this is, at the very least, we have a pretty representative and pretty comprehensive survey. So of these monuments, of that 928, I'm sorry, I didn't total these up because it gets a little complicated to total them up for reasons I won't bore you with. But let's just say the overwhelming majority of monuments in this state are to wars. And that makes sense. I mean, we got Fort Bragg here, we got a lot of military bases, we've had, of course, a lot of North Carolinians fought in the Civil War. There are a lot of reasons why that would be the case. But as you see, the single largest category of monuments in this state are Civil War monuments. And of that 233, I don't remember the exact number, but I'm going to say 225 are monuments to the Confederacy. So there are a few more points about this. There are World War I monuments in this state that record only white soldiers from communities that fought in World War I. They're segregated monuments. A few communities have started to address that. Spanish-American War, as you may know, African Americans could serve in militias, but they never sent African Americans overseas because this was the height of white supremacy. So there are some monuments that don't record African Americans' contributions that could, but then there are some World War II monuments, for example, that do. So anyways, the point that I would make here is we have a lot of monuments to wars, and most of those monuments, of course, celebrate white soldiers. What else do we have in this state? Well, by our count, we have 34 monuments that honor, commemorate, acknowledge African Americans as historical actors. So there are 928 in the state, 34. There are 25 that acknowledge women as historical actors. And that's using a very broad definition of women as historical actors. So for example, in Charlotte, some of you may have seen there's a monument which is of a woman holding up a baby, which we've decided, okay, that's a woman as an agent, a historical agent. But it's no woman doing any particular historical act than, I guess, the act of birth. Indians, not so many. Animals, we've got 10. We've got a wonderful hippopotamus in Wilmington. I love. And then, of course, we have the largest dresser in the world, the largest chair monument, and then the wonderful old coffee pot in Old Salem. So the reason I raise this is not a terribly diverse historical representation of the state in its subject matter. I understand that people would gravitate towards building monuments to war, but it is odd that we have 3 monuments to furniture and household objects, which is 1/7 the number of monuments that represent Native Americans. And actually, I want to go here and then I'll come back. This, I realize, is hopelessly blurry. I don't know if any of you know the Pine Valley neighborhood of Wilmington, North Carolina. Anybody here know it? Well, it was built in the 1950s. And I'll try to talk loud enough so you can hear me away from the mic. All of these streets are named after Confederate generals. So this is Jeb Stuart, this is Robert E. Lee here, Beauregard, Honeycutt. I have a friend who lives there and I asked him, are property values better on Jeb Stuart than Honeycutt? Is it really good to be on Robert E. Lee as compared to Semmes? I mean, I know Admiral Semmes, some of you may be up on him in the Alabama, but still, most of us don't know Semmes. But in any case, when I talk about the commemorative landscape, I'm not just talking about monuments, of course. We've got street names. And in this one extreme case, in Wilmington, North Carolina, literally every single street name in that neighborhood is named after a Confederate. So this is the landscape, the focus of debate. I have up there the monument on the top and the left is the monument in Durham that now what's left is what's on the right. That was the monument that was toppled. We have, of course, the Confederate Monument and that wonderful historic postcard, the monument that graces the Capitol grounds in North Carolina, in Raleigh. We have Silent Sam standing at the front of the University of North Carolina campus. This is the focus of much debate. And then here you have the monuments that you are talking about today. These monuments have become the focus of the debate, I think, in part because of where they're located. Very, very prominent civic spaces that are used by very diverse populations now. And they're also, I think, the focus of debate precisely because the landscape, as I suggested before, if we go back here, this is a landscape that is not currently inclusive. It's not close to being currently inclusive. And so it's the disparity between what America is today, what people would like America to be in the future, and this commemorative landscape that we've inherited that I think has created the conversation we're having today. So thank you all very, very much.